Well, when I gave my, in my last sermon here, I was talking about the pyramids, how that's like my front screen on my laptop, and it's true. So, yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus and women. And yes, I showed this. How many of us were here last time? Just so I know. Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. Because we look surprised. That's all right. So this is one of my favorite pictures of Jesus because it is so seldom that we get to see his teeth in Christian art. In Christian art, he always has his mouth closed. But in this picture, he's smiling, and we see his teeth, and given what we know from like the dental, and the skulls of Galilee in the first century, if anybody was walking around with this many teeth in his 30s, people would have just said, like, of course this must be a god. Like, look at his teeth. But the other thing I really like about this picture is that there he is, and all of these women are really happy to see him. Now there is a fascinating pattern among the Gospels. The four Gospels in the Bible, they have their differences, but on this they all agree. Women liked being around Jesus. Jesus got along with women well. And we don't know, we don't know, the Gospels don't tell us if he was ever married or if he had children. The Gospels don't tell us if he was romantic. The Gospels don't tell us what his, any of that stuff about his personal life. But in all four of the Gospels contain scenes in which Jesus interacts with women, which is very rare in the literature of that time. And he talks with women, including women that he is not related to, and that you were really, as a man in his place and time, you were not supposed to talk with a woman that was not a member of your own family, and she was not supposed to talk with somebody who was outside of her family, to a man who was outside of her family. But all four of the Gospels agree. Women liked being around Jesus. They liked having him around. They invited him to their homes. They would talk with him. And Jesus would, and he does this in all four of the Gospels, he meets women that he doesn't know. He asks them questions, and he listens. He is a good listener. And he actually listens to what they've got on their mind. He listens to their situation, and then he responds in an attentive and appropriate way. He responds to that person in a way that makes it clear that he has been paying attention. The oldest of the Gospels in the Bible is what we call the Gospel according to Mark, but we need to remember all of the Gospels were anonymous. Each one, they were all called the Gospel. And until 300 years into Christianity, nobody had more than one Gospel. So when we think about the Gospels, we think of four Gospels and you have them all together. But if we go back 2,000 years into the first 3 centuries of Christianity, actually there were about 26 Gospels. And different congregations, remember, they were illegal, so they were not in touch with each other. Different congregations would have different documents, and like this congregation had a document that they called the Gospel. And that congregation had a document that they called the Gospel. But nobody had 2. So the Gospels were anonymous. They did not need names. Now, only 300 years into the Christian era, when it was decided that 4 gospels would be, would become standard, and that the other, like 22 gospels, would become illegal and had to be burned whenever you found them. Only then did somebody say, but we can't have 4 books that are all called the gospel. And so it was actually the gospels were 200 to 300 years old when a bunch of bishops got together and they looked at the names of people, associates of Paul, whom he had mentioned in his letters. And they took those names and they put them on the gospels. That's how we come to have what we call the gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. But none of them had a name in the early centuries. The bishops kind of scoured through like early church, documents to find names to give to the gospels. And then centuries later, other Christians used the names of the gospels, and then they went back into the Christian scriptures and they found little biographies, and they said, oh, the Gospel of Mark must have been written by this guy who Paul knew. And that is how the gospel authors come to have little biographies where they say, like, oh, Luke was a doctor, and they say Matthew was a rabbi, whatever. Actually, it came about in a completely different way. Now, I'm bringing this up today because there is, I think, a fascinating theory that the oldest of the Gospels in the Bible, what we call the Gospel according to Mark, may have been assembled by a woman. Now, I say the Gospel was assembled because we know that there were documents floating around. There was a list of miracle narratives. There was the 23rd Psalm, which was then adapted into what we know as the Passion narrative. There were collections of sayings. And so the person who assembled what we call the Gospel of Mark, they assembled these, they used these 3 pieces and some other things, and they put together this first gospel. And in that gospel, Jesus talks with women, he listens to women, and he responds. He's a good listener. The gospels that we call Matthew and Luke take that, the Mark gospel. They copy it pretty much word for word, and each one expands it with kind of a large amount of other text. And then, a century later, what we call the Gospel according to John threw out all of that stuff. Took just the miracle stories, added 2 of them, the wedding and the funeral, and then created this whole other gospel. So today we're going to look at a couple of things from the Gospel according to Mark. I just want for us to remember, it was not called the Gospel according to Mark. It existed for about 300 years, for about 250 years, before anybody gave it a name. And this could be a male author, but it could be a female author putting these things together. What we can say for certain is that Mark is very attentive to women. Now, something that the author of this gospel did, and this was a literary technique of the time, was that the author was assembling from all of these pieces. They had miracle stories, they had teachings, and they were putting the pieces together. And what the author would do is they would take 2 pieces that were connected, that were parallel with each other, and they would put another piece in between. And the example that we're going to look at today is the wilderness feedings. The Gospel according to Mark has 2, not 1, but 2 stories in which Jesus is teaching and people are gathered, and then the disciples say, hey man, you got to cut this short. All of these people need to get home before dinner time. So you need to just wrap up what you're saying right now. And Jesus says, basically, I'm not done talking yet. I still have more to say. But have them sit down, and let's gather up anything that we've got, anything that they've got, and we'll just distribute it equally, and then everybody can have something to eat. And then I can teach some more, and then they can get home and eat on their own time. Now, in the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark, he's there, and he feeds 5,000 people with, this little basket of loaves and fishes, and this is so impressive. And then 2 chapters later, in the 8th chapter, he does it again. But this time he feeds 4,000 people, which is kind of strange to go from the bigger number and then follow it up with a smaller number. Like, why bother to tell the story twice if it's going to get smaller? There is actually a significant difference between these 2 stories. And we'll look at that today. Now, what the author of Mark's Gospel does, the difference between the 2 stories, and the reason that the 4,000 people is the bigger miracle that deserves to be second, is that Jesus performs this miracle in Judea. He performs this miracle among his own people. And then he crosses over. He crosses over into Syria. And he performs the miracle again among Gentiles, among the enemies of his people. And that's why the second story is bigger than the first. And that would have been the real shock of the 2 stories. Not that he would feed his own people, but that then he would cross over into this very hostile place. But that the people there would listen to him, and he would feed them too. He feeds a smaller number of them. But now, how do we get from Jesus feeding his own people to Jesus on the other side feeding the outsiders, feeding the enemies, the Gentiles? The author of Mark's Gospel does this by putting this story, one of the stories that they have, one of the stories that was circulating about Jesus, and they put it in between the 2 stories. Biblical scholars refer to this as the story of the Syro-Phoenician woman. Now, I should say here, the Gospel according to Mark is very attentive to its female characters, but almost never names them. Very seldom names them, which is why the female characters, in the Gospels, there's a bunch of Marys. There's a lot of Marys in the Gospels. And there's a couple of Salomes in the Gospels. There's the one who orders the death of John the Baptizer. Jesus also had a sister named Salome, so apparently it was a fairly common name. Most of the women in the Gospels are the Syro-Phoenician woman, the woman whose daughter was ill, the woman who anointed Jesus, the Gentile woman. Always the such and such woman who is not named. So we're going to look at one of those today. Now, the most famous Syrian woman in the Bible was Jezebel. And Jezebel married King Ahab of Israel. She was Syrian. She, the pagan, Gentile, seductress, kind of sorceress, led him into all kinds of violence. Established shrines for the pagan god Baal, who was the enemy of Israel's God, and ordered the arrest and execution of all of the Hebrew prophets. So Jezebel, one of the most hated characters in the whole Bible. As a matter of fact, Jezebel was hated so badly in the Bible that Jezebel's form of death was that during an uprising, during a revolution, people came looking for Jezebel, and her own palace eunuchs threw her out the window. which is actually where we get the word defenestration, which means death by throwing somebody out a window. Jezebel was defenestrated. Not only that, but when she landed on the ground, her body was picked apart by dogs until only her hands were left. So she is one of the most hated characters in the Bible. Now, interestingly enough, while this one Syrian woman orders the death, while Jezebel orders the death of all of the Hebrew prophets, one prophet escapes. That is the prophet Elijah. And he is hiding in Syria, and he meets another Syrian woman. And this Syrian woman takes him in and shelters him. She is an example, a biblical example, of that stranger who puts themselves in danger by helping someone else. She takes Elijah in, she feeds him, she has a son who's dying, but she still takes care of this fugitive who comes to her door. And when her son dies, Elijah speaks over him, and God brings him back to life. So that is one of the, miracles. But so the Elijah story has these two Syrian women in it, and Jesus meets a Syrian woman. He's just performed the miracle of the loaves and fishes, and this has made him so popular that everybody is mobbing him and saying, you can give away free food. We'll follow you anywhere. He is being mobbed so badly that he has to get onto a boat with his disciples and just sail across the lake just in order to escape the people who want to just turn him into a vending machine. Now he finds himself in this hostile territory, the land of the Gentiles. He does not yet have any idea about teaching the Gentiles or feeding the Gentiles. He's just hiding there. And this woman comes to him and says, and you don't have to read the whole story, but it's there just in case you think I'm making it up. And she says to him, my daughter has an unclean spirit. She says, my daughter is possessed. And at the time, that meant, what we today would call mental illness, like destructive and self-destructive, dangerous mental illness. So this woman comes and says, my daughter is mentally ill, and she is dangerous. And Jesus looks at her, and he sees that she is not one of his people. He sees a Syrian woman, and Israel and Syria liked each other then as much as they like each other now. And he had no intention. And so he says to her, and I preached about this a couple of years ago. He said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. His response is, he has come for the Judeans. He has come for the Israelites. And in the gospel according to Mark, and again, this is one of those things that gets played down in later gospels. But in the gospel according to Mark, Jesus has a finite amount of power. For example, it's in Mark's gospel that Jesus is walking down the street, and a desperate woman who needs to be healed touches the hem of his garment. She touches the edge of his robe. And the author of the gospel says Jesus felt power going out of him. And then he looked around and he saw this woman who had been healed. And he gave her permission after the fact. He forgave her for stealing some of his power. But in the gospel according to Mark, Jesus does not have infinite power to create miracles. He has a finite, limited amount of power, and like a tribal shaman. It's believed that like a Native American medicine person, The belief is this person has a certain finite amount of power, and when it drains away, when it's empty, they die. So in Mark's gospel, Jesus is not an infinite healer. He has a finite amount of power, and what he says is, it's not fair to take the children's food and feed it to the dogs. What he's saying is, I have a limited amount of miracle energy, and it is for the Israelites. It is not for you. And if I give it to you, Syrian, there will be less for them. And that's not fair. So he says this, but in the process of saying it, he is talking with this desperate woman, and he refers to her daughter as being subhuman, as being a dog. He refers to a foreigner, a Syrian, as a dog. And so it's not, he has, in Mark's gospel, Jesus has finite power. He has finite patience. He frequently tells people to shut up. And he also has finite people skills. He is not, if you ever sit down and read Mark's gospel, just with the question in mind, was Jesus friendly? You will find that in the oldest, the earliest of the Christian gospels, Jesus is not friendly at all. He is terse and he is frequently rude. Not a real pally guy. Anyway, so he is rude and racist to this woman, and that is pretty much who he is in that gospel. However, she is quick on her feet, and she says to him, but even the dogs under the table get to eat the children's crumbs. And he thinks about that, which to me is really interesting, because I can think of all kinds of things that I would say to somebody if my kid was in trouble and I asked them for help and they said, your child is not even a human being, like your kid is a dog to me. I can think of all kinds of things that I would say. Or maybe I would have just the presence and the composure to say nothing at all and just walk away. But she's pretty quick here, and she's clever. And Jesus respects that. There's something about that kind of clicks with him, and he was a clever guy. And he says, for saying that, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Another fascinating moment in Mark's gospel. The narrator leaves Jesus and follows the woman home. The story follows the woman home because he wouldn't know whether the child got well or not unless this storyteller, the narrator, actually just went away with the woman and left Jesus to check. And the narrator, not an eyewitness, but like the narrator, the narrative, leaves the main character and follows this woman home to, like, you know, because the story, the narrative itself respects her. And then that's when Jesus decides that he is also going to give one of his lectures in Syria. That's when he decides that he's also going to speak to the outsiders, the Gentiles, and then he performs that same feeding again. And here again, this is not Jesus of the infinite God-like power. This is Jesus of limited power. But he does decide at this turning point, he does decide that he is going to use some of his finite power to, you know, kind of include the outsiders. So this, I think, is a really fascinating story in the gospel, where not only does Jesus end up listening to this woman, even though his first response to her is really rude, but when she speaks back to him, he listens and he really thinks about what she said, and he changes his mind. And this kind of opens his mind about the outsiders. Maybe it opens his mind about the amount of power that he has, and you know, the limits of his ability. I can't tell you how much power Jesus had when you know, whatever. But at least according to this author, he decides to use some of it for this. And this is in the gospel. This is why he does this second feeding among the Gentiles. Jesus says, now in the Gospel of Luke, now a generation later, some other nameless author took this nameless document that we call the Gospel according to Mark and copied it, basically copied it word for word, and expanded it, added a bunch of stuff. And so in what we call the Gospel according to Luke, which is much more focused on this theme of outsiders, including the Gentiles, the author of Luke's Gospel then feels like the point hasn't been made quite enough by the author of Mark's Gospel. So then that author adds this other thing, just in case you've missed it. That author says, and Jesus said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine all over the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow in Sidon, in Syria. So the author of Luke's Gospel kind of makes that connection. He says, this is another story of the Syrian woman and the prophet and a healing. And the author of Luke's Gospel then brings up this other thing. Says, and where were the widows of Israel when the prophet Elijah was a fugitive and needed shelter and needed to be fed? So the author of Luke's Gospel says, in that story, it was the foreigner, it was the outsider who fed the prophet. Do you have any questions about that one before we go on? Now here's an interesting story. This story is found in the Gospel that we call John. The Gospel that we call John is very different. There is Mark's Gospel, which was expanded by one author and became what we call Matthew. It was meanwhile being expanded by another author whom we call Luke. And then there was some other author, decades later, who either knew about that stuff and threw it all away, or just started from scratch and created another gospel, what we call the Gospel according to John. So this is one of those stories. Most of the stories that are in the Gospel of John, that author has a list of 5 miracles, the same list that the author of Mark's Gospel had. But other than that, all of the stories in the Gospel of John are only in the Gospel of John. They're not in the other ones. But this is a really famous one. While Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, he came to the temple. The people came to him and sat down. He began to teach. And the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" Now, what's the question here? What question would you ask if somebody said that? Let's think about it. This woman was caught in the very act of adultery. Here she is. Moses commanded that we stone all adulterers to death. What would you ask? Where's the man? That's right. Like, what do you mean she was caught in the very act of adultery? And adulterers need to be stoned to death, so how come there's only one person here? Well, that's really fascinating. Jesus does not ask that question. That's just my question. Like, how did she commit this adultery? because that was the punishment in the law of Moses, was that if somebody broke one of the 10 commandments, you threw rocks at them until they stopped getting up. And that is one of the most awful ways that you can die. As a matter of fact, that is a form of execution that is still practiced in some places on earth today. Pretty much only against women. The law of Moses was not as concerned about men committing adultery as it was about women committing adultery. And this was largely concerned with inheritance. This was largely concerned with that a man's property should go to his own offspring, and that if he was married and she committed adultery, then that man's property, when he died, might go to somebody else's offspring. And this was the primary concern. Teresa.
So this is how I got involved in Amnesty International.
Uh-huh.
There was a woman who was accused of adultery. She had a small child and they were stoned to death. And my son begged me to do something.
Yeah.
Like I could stop it.
Yeah.
It took me 20 minutes because they were intervening for the cat. But yes, it's still happens.
Yes. Yeah. And it happened in Israel, and it's just unbelievable to envision that. It was, partly it was like a firing squad execution. It was there to make sure that no individual person would have to face the blood guilt and the vendetta, for having committed a murder. So they are about to do this thing. Now, in the story, as I heard it, they brought the woman to Jesus and said, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. And Jesus said, let the one who is blameless cast the first stone. And then this rock just whizzed by his ear and hit that woman. And Jesus turned around and said, Mom, I'm trying to make a point. But that's not what happens in this story. In this story, they said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. They have a feeling Jesus has this reputation for being kind of soft on women. And they don't think, now these are the enemies and the temple priests. They don't think that he's going to let this woman die. But that means that Jesus is going to have to tell people to break the law of Moses. And that means that Jesus will be stoned to death. So now he's in a trap. The only way that he can get this woman out is by himself, by claiming that he himself has greater power than the law of Moses. But in the Torah, the punishment for that is that you will be stoned to death. So he's in trouble here. And he bent down, and now he does this thing that he does once in all of the gospel. He does this just once. He wrote with his finger on the ground. We don't see what he's writing. We don't really see what he's doing. But there is this single sentence fragment in this one gospel raises this issue. Could Jesus write? I guess there's one moment in Luke's gospel where he opens a scroll and then he quotes Isaiah, and some people say maybe he could read and maybe he could write. I don't know. Anyway, so now he's down on the ground trying to figure something out in the dirt. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, here, the word sin has not yet become the Christian word for just universal disobedience of God. The word that he's using here is an archery term which is for when you hit somebody else's target, when your arrow hits somebody else's target. He says, if anybody here has never hit somebody else's target, let that person throw the first stone. He's kind of making a pun on marksmanship, on like, if you're like a bad archer, you can hit her. He does this. It's the Christian concept of sin has not yet been born, but he uses this expression, and this is how they translate it. Once again, they say, he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one come to condemn you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way. And from now on, do not sin again." So he uses this expression again. All right. This is one of those stories in which people are trying to get Jesus in a trap. Either he can let this woman get stoned to death, or he can get stoned to death. Jesus was very clever. He was quick on his feet. He comes up with this thing. And he says, who here has not messed up in their life? And it's the elders who walk away first, because everybody has. And they decide to let this woman go. And when he has done this thing, he talks, he talks with this woman. He asks her a question, she answers, and he lets her go. We're going to look at one more story today. Jesus the Christ. How did Jesus become the Christ? Now let's remember, Christ was not Jesus' surname. It wasn't like he had a birth certificate where somebody wrote like Jesus Harold Christ. The Christ was something that some people called him. It was very controversial because it was illegal to call yourself the Messiah. That was against the law. And for that, you could be stoned to death if you told people you were the Messiah. They would throw rocks at you until you were dead. Christos, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiahu, Messiah. It means the anointed one, the one who is anointed. In the Old Testament, David becomes king because he is anointed by the prophet Samuel. When we hear that Jesus was, quote, the Messiah, and both the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospels of Luke begin with these long genealogies to prove that Jesus is descended from David, although interestingly enough, the two genealogies have David in common, but otherwise are wildly different from each other. Now, David and the other kings of Israel, they were anointed by prophets. David was anointed by prophets, and then the other kings of Israel were anointed by priests. They were all anointed by men, very important men. And in the gospel, according to the gospel that we call Mark, there has to be an anointing scene for two reasons. Number one, you can't call Jesus the Christ unless somebody anoints him, unless somebody puts oil on his head. You can't call him the anointed one unless he's anointed. Also, burial at the time, you would anoint someone for burial, and that meant when someone died, you would rub their body down with oil. Then you would wrap it up in like a sheet, like a shroud. You would put oil on that. The oil would aid the decomposition. And after 1 year of that person being laid out on a slab, Then you would gather their bones. You would take just their bones. You would put the bones into a clay jar called an ossuary, and you would bury that. So you didn't bury the person 5 feet long, you know. You just buried the person in a jar. That's why Jesus he died. Somebody said, my tomb is available. They put Jesus in a tomb and they rolled a stone. It was because he was supposed to be left there for a year. And then when Mary shows up to anoint his body with oil so that it can begin to decompose, then the body's not there, which means Jesus is not going to get anointed for his burial. So it's doubly important that he get anointed now. And in the gospel according to Mark, he is not anointed by a prophet or a priest. Interestingly enough, in the gospel according to Mark, he is not anointed by John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer baptizes him. He anoints people with water. But everybody knew that John the Baptizer was not. So John the Baptizer cannot make Jesus into the Christ. Somebody else has to do it. So according to the gospel, according to Mark, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Now, okay, before we start, can anybody name the person who anointed Jesus? Mary Magdalene. So let's take a look. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment and nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. And some people said, this oil could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. A denarius was a silver coin that today would be worth like $70. So 300 denarii seems like a lot for a jar of special ointment. Maybe they are exaggerating, but they're basically saying, like, we could have given, what is that, like thousands of dollars to the poor. Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Jesus says that she will always be remembered, but he doesn't say what her name is. All we find out is that she's in the town of Bethany and that she lives in the house of Simon. Simon had two sisters named Mary and Martha. This was not Mary of Magdala. This was Mary of Bethany. These were different. Mary was a very common name. But here, the woman is unnamed. We only know that he's in this house and in this town, where he has already been in the gospel. Now, there is the gospel that we call Mark, and then in the next generation, two different authors took it, copied it, and expanded it. So, the author that we call Matthew took the Mark story of the anointing, copied it straight up word for word, and reprinted it that way. The author took that same story of the anointing, then took a different direction. In the Gospel of Luke, we read, a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment and stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. And Jesus said, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven, because she has shown great love. But the one for whom little is forgiven loves little. Okay. Now, this author has taken the very simple narrative of the woman anointing Jesus, and this author has made it very dramatic. He's given this woman this whole story. She is a sinner. Maybe she's an adulterer. Maybe she's a prostitute. She's a woman of the city. She's weeping and washing Jesus' feet with her hair. The author of Mark's gospel never heard of that. The author of Matthew's gospel, copying straight from Mark's gospel, mentions none of this. But now we have this. Now this is the most dramatic of the stories, because here the woman's life is changed. And the author of, in the version in Mark's gospel, the story is not that dramatic. The disciples argue, but the woman's life is not changed. Here we get something very dramatic. All right. A generation later, another author writes another gospel. This was also anonymous. This is the one that we now call the gospel according to John. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. Now we're back in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha. I'm sorry, I got confused about Simon. Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, whom he had raised from the dead. They gave a dinner for him. Martha served. Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume and made pure nard and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. So now we have yet another telling of the story. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. In John's gospel, he is in Bethany in the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha. In Luke's gospel, he is in an unnamed city, which Bethany was not. But now in that gospel, he's in a city, and there's this city woman who is unknown and has this whole big dramatic scene. In John's gospel, now in Mark's gospel, we're in Bethany, where Jesus has these friends, Mary and Martha. In John's gospel, he is in Bethany, where he has these friends, Mary and Martha. But none of the gospels says that this is Mary of Magdala, who was a whole different person, and is not mentioned in Mark's gospel until the very end, in which we meet Mary of Magdala, from whom Jesus casts 7 demons. Whether this means she required 7 separate exorcisms or one big exorcism of 7 demons, we don't know. But none of the Gospels ever says that Mary of Magdala was a prostitute. 600 years later, Pope Gregory I gave a sermon in which he said that Mary of Magdala was clearly the sinner woman in the gospel according to Luke. Even though Pope Gregory, if he had read all 4 gospels, would have known that the gospels of Mark and John clearly locate this in the home of Mary of Bethany. What was it? What was it that made? Here's the real question. What kind of questions were people asking about Mary of Magdala that would have caused a pope to spread this kind of story? What kind of question was he trying to answer by spreading this story? Now, if you watch the Da Vinci Code, it was like Jesus' secret wife, and then Gregory started in order to rumor, or did special relationship. Maybe it was because she had played a very important role in early Christianity, important enough that all 4 of the Gospels, that I'll put it this way, that Mary of Magdala had played an important role in early Christianity, important enough that none of the 4 Gospel authors felt that they could leave her name out and get away with it. So none of them gives us much to work with on why was she important. But they all agree that you can't tell the story without putting her name in there somewhere. We'll look at that in our next session. What do we actually find out in the Gospels about Mary of Magdala? But for today, I can tell you this with great confidence. All you have to do is just check the Gospels themselves, and you'll clearly see that she is not like the prostitute, and she did not anoint Jesus. So, good. Do we have any questions about this? Good. All right. Well, good. So I look forward to continuing this next time. Thank you. Thank you.